That in the last half an hour there has been some developing news, with the police confirming 2 of the 3 attackers who were shot dead. They've been named as Karam Shahzad Butt and Rashid Redouane. We'll give you more details on that in the coming minutes. Let's speak to the BBC's Rob Watson, who's gathered. And I guess, Rob, in some ways the last half an hour has been representative of what's happening in this city. One part remembering those caught up in this atrocity, one part trying to find out how it happened.
And that's a very good way of summing it up, and I've been spending the afternoon here. I mean, it's incredibly moving to see what's happening in this part of town. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know this bit of London, it is fantastically busy. And it's true that people have gone about their business as usual. But of course, you can see behind us, the road is closed. Part of the infrastructure has been blocked off. And you can tell that this is what people are talking about. I mean, I've overheard conversations in the streets, people saying, you know, it was the first thing we talked about when we got into the office. So certainly a great deal of defiance and a bit of getting about their business from the people who live and work around here. And you're absolutely right, there's also been this massive police operation. Remember, it's the second one in just over a week to try and track down, to get the identities of the attackers and anyone who may have been linked to them.
And most of the police activity, apart from here in London Bridge, has been in the east of the city.
Yes, the 2 men who've been named have come from Barking, which is, I guess it's about 4 or 5 kilometres from here. It would take about 25 minutes on my bike. That's where all their investigation has been focused.
In terms of the politics of this, the mayor, of course, didn't talk about politics during that vigil, but earlier in the day he spoke at some length about police cuts, and that issue has become politicised in the context of the general election.
There is a way in which this is rather different to after Manchester. I mean, politics was sort of on hold after Manchester. I don't know whether it's just because now the general election is just a few days away, but I guess the way I'd put it is politics has very much broken out with Jeremy Corbyn, with the Labour Party seeking to highlight police cuts. In other words, linking this to his broader campaign of being anti-austerity, whereas Theresa May and the Conservative Party have, of course, been pointing out Jeremy Corbyn's sort of decades-long position, as some might be seen as giving succour to groups like the IRA, and his lack of experience in security matters and his opposition to all counter-terrorism measures in the past.
There's a striking phrase earlier from Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, the Commissioner, saying we're dealing with a new reality, and I guess whichever government comes in after Thursday, they're going to have to come up with a new strategy to support that.
Sure, and there's a way in which, I mean, of course, it's partly because an election is so close that the politics is sort of magnified. But really, when it comes to the nuts and bolts of the counter-terrorism issue, that is, does everyone think that we should have well-trained police? Does everyone think we should have very competent intelligence services? I mean, of course they do, and a lot of the political disagreements about that are somewhat artificial almost. I mean, the bigger issue, and I think this is where there are differences between the main parties and within them, is the broader question. I mean, everyone agrees you need to have good law enforcement, but that issue, the wider issue, how do we all get along in Britain? What about that issue of multiculturalism that Theresa May has raised, and which David Cameron had raised before her, Gordon Brown, a previous Labour Prime Minister, had raised, and Tony Blair? I mean, those are the really difficult issues, those broader societal issues, and presumably that really will take up a lot of time once things have calmed down after the election.
And there's one point that I think it would be useful to spend a couple of minutes on as the wind blows very fiercely down this street, is that while there's a discussion about police cuts, that's in the context of whether this attack could have been spotted in advance. It's not reference to what happened in London Bridge on Saturday night, because there the response was quite extraordinary.
That's a very good point. I mean, of course, they were there in 8 minutes. And I think the government's argument is, look, in terms of armed officers, the numbers are going back up. And in terms of the intelligence side of the operation, that's Britain's Domestic Intelligence Service, MI5, the Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6, that they have been given more resources. But yes, there's this broader debate about, if you have a 10% cut in police, does that mean that you've got fewer eyes and ears on the street in the community, as some have complained? I mean, of course, the government would come back and say, well, hang on a minute, you can judge Home Affairs policy by police numbers, or you could judge it by crime levels. And of course, they would say crime levels, murder rates have actually gone down, if anything, despite the cut in police numbers.
Just before we carry on talking, if any of you are just joining us, the police in the last hour have named 2 of the 3 attackers who died just up the road from where I'm talking to you from here in London Bridge. Karam Butt was 27. He lived in Barking in East London. We also know that Rashid Redouane has been named by police as the second person. And what's also worthy of note, Rob, is that one of these men featured in a Channel 4 documentary a few months back and was very much known to the authorities.
Yes, and look, there are two ways of looking at this. I mean, there will be some people who say, well, hang on a minute, you know, if one of these people was known, if the attacker on Westminster Bridge was sort of known, if the attacker in Manchester was sort of on the radar, why on earth weren't they stopped? And some people will say, surely that is a police and intelligence failure. I mean, of course, the other way to look at it, and I guess the way the security services would point people towards is, look, we're not a police state. We can't monitor absolutely everyone, and we know the figure. They say over 20,000 people in this country are considered people of interest. A much smaller number they consider to be actively dangerous extremists. And they would say you have to prioritize, and of course there will be mistakes. And they've always said, you know, somebody is bound to get through at some point.
Let me pick out one other element of what Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, said earlier, because she said the majority of threats, we believe, are not coming from overseas. Now, that was very interesting, given what we've heard about some young men being radicalised in places like Libya or Syria and then coming back into Europe.
Well, and this is the point about the way in which the threat changes. I mean, I remember when I started as a defence and security correspondent back in the UK after coming back from Washington, the pattern that Britain's intelligence agencies and the police, counter-terrorism police, were looking at was very specific. It was people quite often of South Asian heritage in the UK who had gone out to train with Al-Qaeda in parts of Pakistan, unruled bits of Pakistan. You can see how just in the last 12 years, the point about how that threat has moved on. You had the Arab Spring, you had ungoverned spaces in Iraq, in Syria, but now they're talking about this idea of people being almost sort of self-radicalized, sort of vaguely plugging into a message put out there by extremists, whether internationally or whether in this country.
Just very briefly, Rob, we've 2 days of campaigning left in this general election. We never imagined it would be focused on security, but that's where it's going to stay, isn't it, between now and Thursday?
I mean, I think it's hard to see it not being that. Theresa May wants to make it more broadly about leadership and about Brexit, but I mean, absolutely, we are in uncharted waters. I mean, we haven't had a major incident ahead of a campaign since 1974. It's new territory.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. So, in the last 30 minutes, we've seen the Mayor of London lead a vigil remembering the 7 people who lost their lives in central London, close to London Bridge. We have also had the police name 2 of the 3 attackers, and of course you'll see ongoing coverage of the London attack and the investigations into it here on the BBC.